Before we get into this episode, there's something that might be of interest that I wanted to tell you about. Scene and Heard, who run this podcast, have been asked by Scotland Food and Drink to undertake a strategic review of the Scotland Food and Drink Excellence Awards. Now, these Excellence Awards have been going for almost 20 years and are a huge mainstay of the food and drink sector. But it's time to ensure that they're still relevant. So if you have ever been involved in the Scotland Food and Drink Excellence Awards, or even if you've ever had an opinion about them, we would love for you, please, to complete our survey. So if you go to the On Farm Twitter, which is at @on_farm UK, and click the link in the bio, there will be a tab in there that will take you to the survey, and it should only take you a very short while to complete, but we would be enormously grateful. Hello and welcome to this latest episode of On Farm. I'm Anna Davis, and as always it's great to be here with you. Now, we launched On Farm back in January 2020. It seems like a long time ago. A lot has happened since then in the world. But we've put out more than 50 brand new episodes in that time, and Monty and I and the rest of the team are extremely proud of what we've achieved. But we also have to accept the fact that when it comes to rural podcasts, we are a bit of a Johnny-come-lately on the scene compared to the guest that we have today. He won't need much of an introduction to many of you, although you will probably be interested in some of his Scottish connections. And you'll be interested also in his motivations for getting involved in podcasting in the first place. So here he comes, the godfather of rural podcasting, Will Evans from the Rock and Roll Farming podcast.
I'm Will. I'm a farmer from northeast Wales near Wrexham. We farm beef cattle and arable crops and do a bit of contracting as well. I live on the family farm with my wife and 4 young daughters. And then a few years ago, I very randomly decided to start a farming podcast, and that has led me to get involved with various different industry things. But first and foremost, I am a working farmer.
I'd love to talk to you more about the farming in a minute, but one of the reasons why we asked you to take part in On Farm today is because you're kind of old hat at this. We're in 50-something episodes.
Old hat. Thanks, Anna.
Not old, experienced hat. How to do really well, offend your guests in the first 30 seconds. But the last episode of yours I listened to was a really interesting one with a guy who shares my surname, Richard Davis, the gentleman who went out to Australia.
Yeah.
And that you said at the beginning of that episode that was your 160th, I think, episode. So you are way ahead of On Farm when it comes to episodes, because we're in number 50 something. But I'm curious because we had various motivations for kicking it off, but I'm curious as to why you started rock and roll farming in the first place. What did you see in your mind as the need or the desire?
Well, I suppose I was doing a bit with social media, and I realised that I was getting quite a good response from non-farmers to just sort of pictures of the farm, if you like. You know, people were interested.
Yeah.
Though I wasn't sort of doing it in a very in-depth way, as you know, as anyone who follows me on social media will know, I don't take it too seriously. I'm quite flippant on there. I just like making people laugh, really. But I sort of came to realise the power of new media, if you like, this sort of stuff that wasn't available very long ago, but now kind of everybody's on. And I was an early listener of podcasts generally, sort of sport and history, you know, random things like that. And then I thought, well, you know, wouldn't it be great if there was a farming podcast? And I've always been someone who's really interested in people and human stories and, you know, how people have got to where they've got to in life. And especially, you know, being so much part of the farming community, I guess, farming stories. And the human stories behind food production, I suppose. So I thought, well, you know, why isn't there a farming podcast? You know, why isn't there someone talking to people about their lives? You know, people who you wouldn't necessarily usually hear from. And I kept thinking, well, why aren't the wider industry doing this? You know, why aren't the NFU? Why aren't the HDB? And then I thought, well, no, if I think this, then I've got to do it myself. It's no good moaning that other people aren't doing it. You know, I need to do it. So I thought, well, okay, I'll give it a bash, and that was it really. I had the idea and sort of made it happen very quickly. Got on YouTube, looked, Googled how to make a podcast, and that was it really. Just sort of contacted a few people, and everybody seemed to respond well. Everybody who I asked if they would do an interview said yes, that'd be great. And it was quite funny to start with. People. Well, first of all, you had to explain what a podcast was to a lot of people.
Yeah. You still find ourselves doing
still
that.
do occasionally.
Yeah.
But even people who had never done any kind of interview before and were probably quite nervous, as soon as you got them on to what they were passionate about, which is usually their livestock or their crops or whatever they're doing in farming, they were away. And just brilliant to hear this sort of passion in their voice. And I didn't want to make it too technical. I wanted to aim it at farmers and non-farmers, and I think we've successfully managed to do that. And from there, it's been this month. It will have been 4 years since I started it, and I've just loved every minute of it.
4 years, wow, yeah. So that really is kind of in the early days of podcasting, because 4 years doesn't seem that long ago, but actually there weren't that many people listening those days. So you were at the forefront and kind of catching people early, which I think is really important.
Yeah, well, I suppose as well. I had the idea to do it, and then I thought, like we all do, I suppose, I had a few sort of creeping doubts. I thought, well, no, this is not really for me. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not someone who has a kind of particularly sort of big personality, or I thought, well, I don't know if I'm cut out to do this. And then I thought, well, no, the last thing you want is to be someone who had an idea and then didn't have the courage to go through with it. So that was a bit of a motivating factor as well. And possibly, if I'm honest as well, I was in my late 30s then, coming up to 40, and the whole thing is probably a bit of a midlife crisis as well, to be honest. So, which my wife and children would tell you is ongoing.
I wonder if maybe I'm in the same boat as you then, because it sounds like we're about exactly the same age, and I hadn't really thought that I was going through a midlife crisis, but maybe that's what I've been doing all along, and I didn't realise. So you obviously don't come from a radio background or anything, but you enjoy people. Yeah. You obviously enjoy chatting to people, and it's sometimes we use the word interview, but it's never an interview. It's always a conversation and a chat to find out more about people. But you must have had to gain a huge number of skills in other areas. I mean, did you know about recording? Did you know about editing and all that kind of thing? Not
a thing. not a thing. I mean, I am probably as much of a I was going to say a sort of standard farmer. I don't know if there's any such thing as a standard farmer, but I left school very young just to come and work on the farm, and that's where I'm happiest. And I'd never done any kind of creative project before, although I've always been quite literary. Is literary a word? I've always read a lot anyway, and I read a lot, and I've always enjoyed writing and things, but I've never done any kind of creative project. So no, it was very much get onto YouTube, watch videos hosted by very irritating American teenagers telling you how to make a podcast, and it's one of those things that I was quite daunted by to start with, and I thought, God, I'm never going to get the hang of this. But then, even in those early days, once you got on kind of podcast forums and things, which I don't recommend, the highly nerdy places, but you thought, well, if all these people can do it, then I can do it. It can't be that difficult. And once you've done a few, as you'll know, it's not that difficult, is it? Once you're up and running with it. So
yeah. Well, I have to admit, when it comes to editing, I have no idea if it's difficult or not. Because I'm a bit lazy, and trusty Dave, our producer, does that for me. But as far as I'm aware, you do your whole podcast from start to finish yourself. Is that right?
I do, yeah. And
wow.
I'm not. I don't think I'm very good at editing because I'm not ruthless enough. So I find it all so interesting. I can speak to people for an hour and a half and find every minute interesting. So I find it really hard to cut things out. So that is, I think, probably the thing that I'm worst at. of course, with busy farm and mixed farm, we're always busy with something, and the kids and all the things they have going on and other stuff I do as well. I do end up doing it very early morning or very late at night. But, it's like anything, isn't it? I certainly wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. So, yeah, as long as I enjoy it, I'll keep doing it.
Well, exactly. And, like us, you had a bit of a holiday for a wee while back then because, it's a lot of pressure, particularly when you're doing every task yourself. It's a lot of pressure to feel as though every single week you've got to have fresh new content, when you might have a week where you're not feeling particularly chatty. You might have a week where you've just got so much on that you just can't get to it. So it's challenging, I guess. I don't know if you feel the same, that you kind of build up an expectation and people want to be listening to you every week. But at the same time, that presents a huge pressure. So sometimes you just got to think, deep breath, let's have a rest, and then kind of come back fresh. Do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And I, like a lot of people, had a really sort of difficult summer. The weather was terrible. Harvest dragged on and on and on. And just sort of pressures of farming and everyday life and everything built up, and it all got a bit on top of me. So yeah, I did have a break from the podcast for I think it was about 4 months in the end. I always did intend to bring it back, and when I did bring it back, I was full of renewed enthusiasm. So, but what I have done since I brought it back in just over a year ago, I whereas before I had religiously put one out every week and put a lot of pressure on myself to do so. Now I tend not to. I tend to put out about 3 a month. So I have a week in a month where I don't do one, and it just, I don't know. It works a bit better for me. I'm trying to get a bit better at not putting too much pressure on myself, because I think we all do that to an extent, don't we?
We do, yeah, definitely. And when you brought it back, what was it that made you think, right, now is the right time? I feel ready to keep going again, I suppose. I think
it was just I had a few mental health problems, which was probably just burnout, really. And I sort of got to a point where it's hard to articulate, but I felt like everything was crashing down on me, and because I probably was doing too many things all at once, I felt like I wasn't doing anything well enough, and I was kind of letting everybody down. So I wasn't spending enough time with my wife and my kids, so then I was letting them down, and then if I was with them, I felt like I was letting the farm down, and then I felt like I wasn't doing the podcast well enough because I didn't have enough time to do research and things. So it just all kind of came crashing down, and in the end I went to the GP. I was on antidepressants for 6 months, which I'm very happy to talk about, because it's it is an illness, and we need
to raise awareness.
We do, and I'm not ashamed of it. It is what it is, and I would I'd go on them again if I have to. I hope I never will, but I'm great now. I'm fine. But it was a big thing for me, and I don't think I'm fully come to terms with it yet. But the antidepressants helped. In the end, it took a while to work, but in the end they helped, and I just sort of felt full of renewed enthusiasm again. And I suppose despite everything, I do love doing the podcast. It is a lot of work, but you get to speak to so many inspiring people, and inspiring is perhaps a bit of an overused word, but some of the people I speak to have just overcome such great challenges in their life, or they've really sort of seized the bull by the horns and done something really different. And those people who I wouldn't normally encounter or get the chance to speak to, and have a very in-depth conversation over an hour, which we don't tend to do that much in our lives anymore, do we? So getting that opportunity is a real privilege, I think, and I do find it, I suppose selfishly, I take that enthusiasm and drive, I hope, back to my own life, and that sort of level of inspiration, it gives me a real lift, I think.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and never more so than in lockdown. We don't have conversations in any depth with people because we're not seeing them at the moment, and I suppose that will help you, as you've outlined. It certainly inspires, and I know you're right, it is an overused word, but it's got a good meaning. So let's just carry on. You do meet virtually meet and talk to inspiring people, which improve your day.
Yeah.
And then I suppose, how much do you kind of think about the listeners? Because I think, particularly with your podcast, I don't want to use the word reliant, but, you're cheering up people's day. And perhaps for people who live alone, you're providing company. That's quite a weird and difficult thing to think about. But does it go through your mind ever?
Yeah, it does. It does sometimes. It's funny. I was actually talking to my wife about this not long ago, about how, I can't sort of emphasize enough really how odd all this has been for me, because I left school literally as soon as I could, went home to, that well-worn path that farmers' sons take, straight home to the farm, all I ever wanted to do. And then for a long time, I did Young Farmers and all that sort of stuff. And I did go to Harper Adams for a few years, and I loved all that, but I never really looked outside my own sort of few hundred acres, if you know what I mean. I really didn't. I was just very focused on the farm. We made a lot of changes, and I'm very proud of the business we have here. But it was only sort of the last few years since starting this little podcast in my spare room, the things that have happened to me that I don't really think about, but one day I think I will. I think suddenly I'll sit down and look back and think, well, how the hell did all that happen? All that weirdness. I suppose I do. In answer to your question, though, I occasionally things do get through. Yeah, I had a lovely, sometimes you get messages. I had a very lovely email from a lady who was having very aggressive course of chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. She listens to the podcast every week, and the chemotherapy was terribly affecting her sleep, so she'd end up just sort of lying awake in bed every single night, and and she kind of would listen to the podcasts, and it would help her, as she said, it would help her get through the night and face her demons. And she was obviously extremely worried about what she was going through, as you can imagine. So things like that, it's not something I dwell upon, but it does mean something. And when we've talked about mental health on the podcast, I've always had messages afterwards. I had a very long message after one interview in particular where we talked about mental health from a farmer in Australia, actually, who I think he was an older gentleman. Very long email, and he just said, "Hearing this podcast has saved my life." I was absolutely on the floor. Somebody's recommended this podcast. I've listened to it, and on the back of it, I've reached out to my GP. Things like that. Again,
that's phenomenal.
It is. I don't, and that's all down to the guests for opening up and being brave enough to do so. But when I stop and think about it, that is pretty cool.
Sure is.
Yeah, it does mean it does mean something to me. Yeah. Yes, it does. Yeah.
So you must be like us in a way. We've had so many tears.
Yeah.
We heard from a lady called Sarah Scarrett about an experience she had and a conversation she had with a farmer who had been considering taking his own life. And we've spoken to Nina Clancy from RSABI. Monty was in tears a couple of weeks ago talking about equine grass sickness and the devastating impact that has on horses and people. And it's an emotional journey sometimes, isn't it? But overwhelmingly positive in that, you're hearing inspiring stories, you're helping people at the same time, and getting out stories that otherwise perhaps wouldn't have a channel to reach people.
Yeah, very much so. And you're Welsh like me, Anna. We're emotional people anyway, aren't we? So it doesn't take much to set me off at the best of times. So yeah, those kind of human stories are always hard hitting, aren't they? And and some of the people I've spoken to, a couple in particular, sort of Patrick Joyce, who I spoke to, who at the time had terminal cancer, and spoke about his diagnosis and how that had sent him into a spiral of depression and affected his family and things like that. And Patrick's since passed away, but I've kept in touch with his wife Zanna, and things like that. Just I don't know, just getting the chance to. He raised a huge amount of money in the last sort of 6 months of his life, and just sort of getting the chance to, I suppose, help with that in a very small way. Help get that message out there. I think is a real privilege, and it means a lot to me.
Oh, I bet, and quite right too. You're doing a great service by people, I think. Now we know the stats about how podcast listenership is increasing at a crazily fast rate. But it may be true to say that occasionally the farming community are perhaps a little bit more tardy at catching up on certain digital trends than others. Trying to be very diplomatic here.
Yeah.
But do you think, if we're having another conversation in 2 years' time, what do you think will be the state of play in terms of the agricultural sector listening to Rock and Roll Farming and On Farm and any other podcasts that happen to be out there?
Oh, I think in 2 years' time, every single person in the farming community will have their own podcast, won't they? That seems to be the way it's going. I think lots of people have discovered them, obviously, this year as well, and certainly by some of the messages I've had, people have discovered Rock and Roll Farming this year, and then they've gone and listened to the back catalogue and things like that. And I'm sure it's the same with On Farm, which is lovely. And I think one of the nice things about podcasts and the podcast community is everybody's always willing to help each other. So, when I started my podcast, I got in touch with a few other podcasters and things and asked them for help, and they were only too willing to do so. And I've helped one or two people get going with their podcast, and it's not really about, I certainly don't feel like I'm competing with other farming podcasts. It's not, it's not the point at all. I just want to see others, and it's just about sort of getting that message out there positively about farming, making sure we're in that digital space. We can't stop the negative stories about farming, and obviously there are people out there who are against farming and particular kinds of food production, and we can't stop that. That's fine, that's their point of view, but we've just got to make sure that as many of us as possible are putting out our side of the story as well. And from my point of view, the more people who are putting out podcasts and videos or whatever kind of digital media in the farming and agricultural space, the better. Yes,
I completely agree. You've got to, as you say, you can't combat the negative. All you can do is put out the positive. I suppose always in my mind as well is kind of what you've touched on. Is we would love more non-farming people to listen to our podcast and to your podcast and to every rural podcast, because actually there's a huge amount that we'd like them to know. What do you think about that non-farming audience and how we reach them?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I mean, I very consciously early on decided not to make it too technical. I try not to have too much farming jargon. I try not to go too much in depth. And I listen to several farming podcasts that are like that are aimed at farmers. And, there's some absolutely brilliant ones out there, but that's not really what I was trying to do. And judging by certainly the sort of messages I get, I would say, and you're right, it is hard to find out exactly, but I would say probably 50-50 with me. I do get a lot of non-farmers listen. And I know several of them have messaged me to say that they have then kind of told their friends and things like that. So, that stuff makes me think that I must be doing something right with it. And then I see sort of things like, I never wanted to, one of the reasons why I like doing a podcast is because I'm behind a microphone asking questions, or usually, I know today I'm answering questions, but which does make a nice change, but I'm most comfortable when I'm asking questions. So like I could never do videos in a YouTube channel. But I think it's just not I just wouldn't be very good at it, and I wouldn't be very comfortable with it. But some of the people who are doing those now, people like Tom Pemberton, obviously Hannah Jackson, people like that, they do such a good job, and they get, some of them have got like 100,000 plus subscribers, So, so a lot of those will be children. A lot of those will be, I would presume, the majority will be non-farmers. So it just, there are people in the farming community who are doing it right and are really helping the industry. And, long may that continue. And, I'm so full of admiration for those people, because as we know with a podcast, it takes up a lot of time, and it'll be the same for those people doing videos and things. So, Yeah, all these things kind of add up, don't they? And the more people doing it, the better, I think.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what you said earlier about, it's not a competition. We're not rivals of yours and vice versa, because it's got to be about getting those messages out to as wide an audience as possible. And I suppose the ideal scenario is that people listen to your podcast and ours, and I'm sure many do.
Yeah, very much so.
But we've got to kind of all rally together. And I think, I sometimes think, actually the support is out there and it's been phenomenal. I know you have regular support from NFU Cymru, and you probably have, sort of moral support from thousands of organisations. And I think that really helps. But I suppose actually we just like everybody to share stuff. This podcast is free to listen to, and hopefully everybody's learning something. All podcasts are free to listen to, but hopefully every time they listen to you or us, they're learning something. So the more support we can get from every corner of agriculture just to share the link, the better. Would you say you've had a crazy level of positive support in terms of getting that kind of sharing going?
Yeah, I have, but I know what you're saying. It would be nice if wider industry helped as well. Some of the stuff, various things I've been involved in, not necessarily with the podcast, and I don't want to mention any names in particular, but I have been quite frustrated sometimes with wider farming industry that often some of the industry bodies seem to be competing against each other rather than working together.
Yes.
And a big part of what I do is trying to bring people together. I'm a big believer in sort of collaboration and working together and finding common ground. So I have been frustrated at that at times, but then I suppose, again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. I suppose if you sit and wait for other people to do things for you, then it doesn't happen. I suppose you've got to make it happen for yourself. So, I think the rise of these kind of podcasts and some of the other things I've mentioned, I guess it all helps. But yes, some assistance and greater support from wider industry is always welcome.
I agree. I think, it's great, but there's always room for improvement. Yeah. Now, this might be a difficult question to answer, I suppose, but thinking, you've got 4 daughters, so you've got double the trouble of me because I've got 2. But thinking about them, when they get to our age, we kind of know where we've all got different views, but we all know where we want farming and agriculture to be. But how do you think that the kind of digital and including that podcasting revolution will help farming to get its message across between now and whenever our daughters are in their early 40s?
Yeah, I think massively. I mean, I think back to when I was younger, and farming, there were some exceptions, but it pretty much was a closed shop. There were not many new entrants in farming at all. It's certainly, I mean, it's not particularly diverse now, but it certainly wasn't a diverse industry then. And it wasn't anything that even people talked about or thought about, I don't think. And you look how that's changed over the last few years. And I think young women are the fastest growing demographic in farming, I think. And, although we've got a long way to go in terms of diversity in the industry, I do think, it's improving slowly. I think there's so much opportunity for new blood in farming, new entrants, people come in with different ideas, people who perhaps question, and we all do this to an extent, don't we? Even if I try and be very open-minded to change, and I try and be aware not to get too stuck in a, we've always done it this way kind of rut. But at the same time, sometimes when you've been farming for a long time, and you're part of a farming family, you just don't notice things, things that, perhaps you just walk past them every day and you don't question it. Whereas new entrants and people who come into the industry from different sectors or different backgrounds, they invariably do look at things in a different way. And then that pushes the rest of us on, because then suddenly, we're seeing what they're doing and think, well, maybe we could do that as well, And I think that's really important, to have that sort of diverse industry of different people from different backgrounds, different ideas. And so I hope that continues. My kids are quite young. I have no idea whether they'll go into farming. or not, even if they do want to go into farming, I would hope they would perhaps go off and do something else for a few years first. If they do want to, that would be fantastic. Nothing would make me prouder than being Evans and daughters one day here on the farm.
Oh yes, that sounds
that'd
good.
be pretty cool. But if they don't want to and they all scatter to the four winds, then we'll have to decide what to do then.
Totally forgotten what I was going to ask you next. Actually,
don't worry, I know what that's like. I did a podcast yesterday. I interviewed someone yesterday, and I did exactly the same thing. I had absolute, yeah.
I remember now. I said, you said at the beginning that first and foremost you are and will always be a farmer.
Yeah.
Do you think you've learned anything from your podcasting journey that's a kind of transferable skill back to the farm? Might seem like a strange connection, but has it taught you anything that's improved your farming abilities, do you think?
Yeah, so I'd say it has actually, because I've always been a bit, as anyone will know me, and particularly my wife would tell you, I'm not a particularly organised person. So I'm quite, my mind is quite scattergun, I think, in the way I think of things. But what the podcast has definitely taught me is to be much more organised and to be able to, and I am involved with a fair few different things now. I'm recently, I'm one of the new directors of Oxford Farming Conference and sort of different things. And what all this has taught me is how to be much better organised and to be able to, I suppose, easy for me to compartmentalise things better. Yeah, I'm just much more organised, and I think that has a knock-on effect for every aspect of my life, I think.
As they say, if you want something done, ask a busy person. And I stand by that motto, because the more you've got to do, the more you're forced into being organised.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, I'm assuming that your podcast Rock and Roll Farming will still be going in another 4 years' time, another 8 years' time, etc. But so far, what do you think has been the biggest sort of personal win for you, having created it 4 years ago?
I think, in all honesty, when I started the podcast, I suppose like everyone else who starts a podcast, I was always checking download numbers, and I if it went down 1 week, I was like stressing about it. But I honestly don't do that anymore. In fact, I very rarely look at downloads or figures at all, because it's just not why I do it anymore. I do it because I get people who listen every week, who message me every week. It's just such a lovely little community, and it that has, again, without wishing to sound cheesy, and it's not meant in this way, it really has sort of enriched my life, really. There are lots of people who listen from all around the world, who message me all the time, who I'll probably never meet, but I feel like by doing the podcast, I'm providing them with a little bit of interest every week, or a bit of entertainment, or whatever it might be, and that is just a really nice feeling. So again, emphasis, that is 100% down to the guests, and them coming on and being willing to talk about their lives and what they do in such an engaging way. But having that feeling that I am contributing, I suppose, is very important to me. So yes, I suppose of all the things it's led to, that is still the most important. Yeah, it's the community aspect of it, I think, that's the most important to me, and I don't see that changing.
Yeah. I'm dying to ask, actually, I don't know if you ever check, because we don't check very often, but in the early days we used to check our reviews and what people said about us, and it still makes me laugh, because I think on about week 2 somebody left us a 1-star review on Apple and said, "This lot don't know what they're talking about," or something like that. Monty was dead set on trying to find out who it was and go and leave something nasty on their doorstep, I think. But, thankfully, we've had positive reviews since then. But have you ever had anybody take exception to something that you've done?
I don't think I've ever had any bad reviews on on Apple, I've had some really nice reviews on there. I mean, I get a bit of that on social media sometimes, but then, social media is a funny place anyway, and I would like to think that if those people met me in real life, they'd think I was okay. But again, if they didn't, then that's fine as well. Not everybody's cup of tea. I'm very aware of that.
Well, no. But as my husband said actually to me this morning, he said, well, he must be a hit with the ladies in Scotland, because whenever he interviews anybody in Scotland, it's always a woman.
I hadn't thought about that. I suppose I have interviewed quite a few women in Scotland, actually. Yeah, well, I suppose Scotland is a bit I always think of Scotland as my sort of second country in a way, because I've got family who farm just outside Dundee. My auntie and uncle and cousins farm just outside Dundee. And I've got some very good friends up there as well. So we try and get up to Scotland as often as possible. My wife and I got engaged in the Highlands, and love Scotland. So any
You're a bit like me then.
Yeah.
I'm half Welsh and half Scottish, so I feel quite divided. And obviously live in Scotland. Haven't visited Wales for a very long time, but I always love a Scotland-Wales rugby match because I can't lose.
Yeah, well, it's also the best game, isn't it? It's always very entertaining. So
yeah, definitely. It's been really, really fascinating to chat with you, Will, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. But I think we're on the same wavelength that it takes up a lot of our time. It's certainly never going to make us rich, but
no.
It's something that's enjoyable, and you feel as though it's worthwhile. And I think collectively, the more people we can get listening, we're always saying to people, just show your granny or show your dad how to physically download a podcast, because we find that actually that's a bit of a barrier for people. They want to listen because if you love the radio, you're going to love a podcast. But sometimes people are just a little bit fearful of the mobile technology and don't know how. So anybody who is listening, just go and show somebody if they don't know how to do it. That's always a good start. But I think, collectively, we just love more people to embrace podcasting so that they'll listen to everything out there and learn something and enjoy something.
For sure, yeah. I echo everything you just said there, and certainly in terms of sort of older people, and I think the pandemic is, we've all been isolated for a long time, so a lot of people, a lot of older people I know have been stuck on their own in their homes for several months now, and it's things like podcasts can make a difference to people's lives. So anything you can do to help in terms of that, I think is really important. And and again, on coronavirus, and sorry to talk about coronavirus because it's dominating everything.
We can't avoid it.
We can't. But I suppose what it has done, I guess, is again emphasise the importance of community and people keeping an eye out for each other and helping each other along. So and anything that people can do in that regard, I think I'm all in favour of.
Yeah, well, definitely, and Zoom is all well and good, but hopefully we can get to meet in person at some point once COVID is out of the way, and perhaps if you're ever up for the Highland Show, or we're down for the Royal Welsh or something. It would be great to catch up and share a G&T and share more stories.
What a thought that is. Can you imagine being on a sunny day at the Highland Show now? God.
Oh, blissful.
I know. Yes, no, I'd love to do that. Yes, and obviously you're welcome anytime.
It was really great to spend some time chatting to Will. So thank you, Will. It's been fascinating, and I think we have a lot to learn from you. I'm sure you do already, but if you haven't, please do go and find the Rock and Roll Farming in your podcast feed. And thank you, as always, for listening. As Will and I both said during the episode, and as we say a lot, we totally rely on you to recommend the podcast to people and spread word of what we're doing. So please do share this episode on Twitter and Instagram, or even Facebook, if you've enjoyed it. If you remember to tag us at @on_farmuk, we'll be able to say thank you to you in person, hopefully. An honourable mention this time to my cousin, Stephen Young, who said on Twitter that our latest episode with SAOS was, and I quote, edging towards quite good. Stephen, Thank you very much. You'll be getting a nice clip round the ear next time I see you for being so cheeky, but nevertheless, I realise that you don't give compliments easily, so very much appreciative. Thank you, Stephen. The On Farm podcast, Telling Rural Stories, is brought to you by our team at Scene and Heard. That's the PR and marketing agency that my co-host Monty and I run together. We offer services from branding and web building to social media management, media relations, PR and marketing strategy, and of course, podcast production and training. So please do get in touch if we can help you. And meantime, see you next time.